Wow.
Because how can an invisible person or imaginative person have a social history? Well, Satan does. Because it's about how people see other groups.
This is powerful. I must make a poke. I hope you don't mind me mentioning this, but I have some scholars that come on, they're PhDs, and they're mythicists, right? They're not in academia. And their proposition is that Jesus was an angel, right? Which that means he wasn't historical, which would go outside of the academic world. But one of their arguments is, and this is one of the things that you did so nicely in your book, they said, well, look, Jesus was crucified by demons and things like that, as Paul seems to portray, like the archons of this age. And what you did was so wonderful. You connected, yes, they were superstitious. Yes, they thought there were spiritual forces at work here, but there were people that were vilified and as the enemy. And this is why I loved your book so much, because it's not just spirits in the heavens. It's not just people on earth. It's this cosmic on earth as it is in heaven type of cosmic battle, which is the prayer that you hear Jesus talk about, on earth as it is in heaven. There's like this spiritual / real world idea that they had. And so it takes this and makes it reality on earth, which makes more sense for the historicists. But
you're exactly right. And that's what was different about my work. Other people had talked about religion as ideas and fantasies, imagination, invisible beings. And I want to say, yeah, okay. But what's it about? It's about issues that are right down here on earth. And it's about groups that are split. So when the followers of Jesus, like whoever wrote the Gospel of Mark, he said, well, I want you to know from the start, the Spirit of God came on Jesus when he was baptized. And the Spirit of God was with Jesus. But it drove him into conflict with the Satan. So Jesus's life is seen as a struggle of a man who is contending with the Spirit of God and Satan. And that is played out right here on earth. And all of that is when people, Christians, evangelicals, liberals, whoever they are, Catholics, Protestants, you name it, they're all talking about life here on earth in some specific way. So I wanted to write, what's going on here? So I was looking at the New Testament. I thought, okay, so in the New Testament, this writer is saying, well, Jesus is on God's side, okay? Who's on Satan's side? Well, I thought, well, it would be what? Who? It'd be the people who crucified Jesus. That would be what? The Romans and some of the Jewish leaders who participated. That's not what I found. I was really shocked. I thought I knew the New Testament. I've been teaching it. But I never noticed that in Mark, Satan is only identified with Jews and Jewish enemies of Jesus, and never with the Romans who actually crucified Jesus. I mean, Jews didn't crucify Jesus. He was crucified by the Romans because he was considered somebody inciting revolution against Rome. Crucifixion is the most horrible penalty, and it's reserved for slaves and traitors to Rome. And Jesus was regarded as that. So I thought, wow, this is amazing. Because we know historically, who crucified Jesus? The Romans did. Only Romans had the equipment. You have to have an army to do that. It takes equipment, it takes technology, it takes soldiers. Right. And the Romans did it a lot. I mean, they crucified thousands of Jews on the same charges in the first century. Jesus wasn't unique that way. In fact, about the time he was born, there were 2,000 Jews crucified near Nazareth for starting a rebellion against Rome. So, but religious people see this in terms of God and Satan. So I thought, this is so weird. Why would the followers of Jesus effectively exempt the Romans and blame Jews for what Jews didn't do? And I would realize the story was told as though the crucifixion was engineered by Jews, even though Romans did it. Historically, Derek, that doesn't make sense. They didn't have the means. They didn't have the legal right. They couldn't have done it. So I had to figure out why. And I finally realized that these people, followers of Jesus, were writing right after there was an enormous Jewish revolution against Rome. And in fact, it was such a huge revolution, like the American Revolution, trying to get rid of the British. These were Jews trying to get the Romans out of their city and their city of Jerusalem and out of their land and stop dominating all the nations that the Roman Empire dominated. But they lost the war because the Romans had massive military power. And they went into Jerusalem and 60,000 troops. They devastated. They massacred thousands of people. They destroyed the entire center city and burned it down. The temple of the Lord was burned down, and Jesus and his followers then, who were still alive. That was 30 years after his death. Were regarded as followers of a convicted revolutionary. So if you were a follower of Jesus 30 years after his death, they'd say, well, that man, he's a follower of that Jesus of Nazareth, that revolutionary. He's probably one of them. And so they were crucified. Peter was crucified. Paul was beheaded because he was a Roman citizen, and Roman citizens got quicker deaths that weren't as painful. Jesus' brother James was stoned to death in Jerusalem. Horrible way of dying. It takes a long time, like crucifixion. So they didn't want to be seen as revolutionaries because it was so dangerous. So they basically told the story of the death of Jesus in a way to sort of say, well, okay, Romans did it, but it was the Jews who instigated the whole thing.
Do you think that was a save their hide? Or
yes.
Do you think there was, let me ask you this, do you think there was any historical verisimilitude to the idea of Jewish sects disagreeing with a historical Jesus who's preaching some message, and he's facing guys on earth at this time that are actually rejecting him and actually saying no, and that gave them ammunition to say, look, not only look what happened in 70 AD, because you didn't listen to the guy, we're blaming you guys. You didn't listen to him, and God sent the Romans as punishment like he did, to the Babylonians, whatever else in the Old Testament. I don't know.
Well, you're totally right. That happened a little bit later, but early on, and there were Jews who thought Jesus was a heretic, and he was a troublemaker, and some people thought he was a revolutionary, but likely the evidence suggests to me that he wasn't. Some people claim that he might have been, probably not. But his followers were not starting a revolution, but they were under suspicion. So basically, yes, I think it was a Savior Hyde thing, because it means, look, our leader was arrested for being and crucified for being a revolutionary, but it was a false charge. His own people ganged up against him, and they accused him of things he wasn't guilty of. And that's what happened. And the Romans wanted to release him. They knew he was innocent. Pilate was such a nice guy. Well, if you look at the history, Pilate wasn't that way at all. He crucified people without trials all the time.
I'm not laughing about the seriousness of it. I just think it's funny because it's like, this is interesting. Yeah.
Oh, it's so fascinating, because when you study the history of religion, Derek, it changes the way you see that whole collection of stories. It doesn't change everything, but it just changes the angle. So I began to realize, I started looking at stories of Satan as kind of a joke, the cartoon figure. And I came right up against the real world, just like you say, the real social world, and how followers of Jesus had really demonized Jews. And that was not a problem as long as they were being hunted by Romans and crucified and executed. But when they came into power in the 4th century, they legislated laws against the Jews. You could be burned alive for converting someone to Judaism. And in the Middle Ages, in the Holy Roman Empire, Jews were considered the killers of Christ. And they were hunted, and they were targeted, and they were, it's absolutely horrific to see how Christians have treated Jews for thousands of years if you start to study it. Jonathan Carroll wrote a book called Constantine's Sword about this, and he stopped being a Catholic priest. He said he was
Wow.
so appalled by the treatment of Jews when he realized what actually happened. So then when you look at the 19th and 20th century, you know, the Holocaust, if you look in Germany, Hitler was actually, well, his propaganda minister was a Christian, believe it or not, Joseph Goebbels. And he said, Hitler is bringing in the 1,000-year reign of Christ. That's why it's the Dritte Reich, the third kingdom, is the third millennium. And he's coming as the forerunner of Christ, and he's getting rid of all the Jews who are enemies of Jesus. Ooh. And Jesus wasn't a Jew, if you read Nazi propaganda. So anyway, you can't blame the whole Holocaust on Christians, but there was fuel for that fire.
Even it did have religious motivation for
even
sure.
In the New Testament, and I was so shocked to see it because I'd never noticed. And my professor at Harvard said, there's nothing anti-Semitic in the New Testament. And I said, like, have you read it lately? I mean, I didn't actually notice it, though, because it's kind of woven into the story of the crucifixion in a way that I hadn't noticed. But if you read anti-Semitic propaganda to this day, Jews are called Christ killers. I gave the book to a friend of mine. He said, I sat up all night reading it. I didn't know why they called me a Christ killer in Boston. I'd never killed anybody.
Oh, wow.
And really, I talked about this recently at Stanford University, and 4 Jewish scholars in our group of it was a research place, they said, hey, we don't know anything about the Bible. We just know one thing, that the Jews killed Jesus. And I thought, whoa.
Yeah, see, I've interviewed with Rabbi Tovia Singer. He's a Jewish apologist, and his goal is to try and obviously, stop Christians from trying to convert Jews to Christianity. And so he deals with a lot of fundamentalist Christians. But he was talking, and I think this is a perfect segue to get into the Gospels a little bit, to hear your insight on the evolution, so to speak, of what's happening. We briefly touched it, but in your book, you actually go and show examples. I don't expect you to necessarily have to pull up examples, but Mark starts off, and it doesn't really carry the depth of anti-Semitism, whereas Rabbi Singer believes that Matthew's actually more anti-Semitic than what people give credit for. And one of the reasons he did, and this is just an example love to get your insight on, he says, you got a GPS for a star that's directing you to where the Messiah is. Now you have to stop at King Herod's palace. For what? To ask him where you got the star directing you. Why are you asking him where the Messiah is? So he said the point is, he thinks, is that the author's trying to say at every turn the Jews don't get it. And they're blamed. Blame the king of the Jews right here for wanting to be a Christ killer himself. He's wanting to hunt the Messiah. That's anti-Semitism. What do you think?
I think that's true. And what Matthew is saying there is that when Jesus is born in Bethlehem, who comes to give him gifts and worship him?
Gentile, foreigner, strangers.
The representatives of all the Gentile nations, because the 3 Magi, the 3 kings, represent the 3 nations of the world as seen from the Hebrew Bible. And the Jewish enemies of Jesus are, like you say, are trying to kill him. And then Jesus goes up on a mountain and gives you he gives you the Sermon on the Mount like Moses. I mean, he's pictured like Moses, but it's a book that appeals deeply to people who love the Hebrew Bible. But as you say, the 4 Gospels are written after the death of Jesus. Mark about maybe 40 years after, Matthew and Luke 50 or 60 years after, and John maybe 60 or years after. And the further you get from the history, the more hostile these get to the Jews. If you look at John 8:44, right? Jesus is speaking to Jews who did not believe in him. And he says, you come from your father, the devil. They say, our father is Abraham. No, you come from your father, the devil. And in the story of Jesus's crucifixion in John, Jesus says to Pilate, Pilate says, your own people turned you over to me. And I've got nothing against you. I mean, Pilate is Mr. Good Guy, and he wants to talk to Jesus about philosophy. But the Jews are trying to kill him. The Jews hate him. In Matthew says the whole people shouted out, "Crucify him." This is totally anti-historical, I believe, for reasons I show in the book.
If I may, and this is a great point you bring up, it goes right into the "you are of your father, the devil," or Satan. When we go back into the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and we find this narrative of the serpent in the garden.
Yeah.
Revelation harps on this. Now, in its original context, I get it. This didn't mean necessarily what they make it mean in the New Testament. Context is oftentimes rehashed throughout the Bible. Even in the prophets, it means something different than it did in its original context, maybe in the Pentateuch.
Yeah.
But my question gets to, and this is going to lead us also into the Gnostics in a way, but right now I wanted to center on the Gospels. There's the idea and argument in Genesis 6 that these are giants. Why? It's clear that the Mesopotamian backdrop to the source material here is pulling off the Apkallu, and there's all these giant heavenly sages that are teaching mankind all of these tools of civilization that they're not supposed to do, and they're annoying the gods. Depending on the source you get, they're too noisy, and they're doing the labor for the gods, and the gods are like, look, send them a flood. Well, in the Bible, it's different. It's wickedness and cruelty, and they're being very abusive, or they're bad. They're being very wicked in the way they approach. Let's flood them out. Well, Jews say that this is actually not divine giants, angels, or Elohim, small gods. These are humans, and it's the line of Cain. So this whole friction that happens, we know Second Temple literature, Jewish literature kind of indicates it's giants and Enoch and other things. But then you also have this idea that these are real human line, bad seed people. And the New Testament seems to act like from righteous Abel to righteous Zechariah in Matthew, he talks about the blood's going to come down. Well, who killed Abel? Cain. Who's Cain? Is he the father? What is going on here? Can you tell me what you found out about this?
Well, you just have there's a lot of stories packed into that. But where I thought you were going to take it, Derek, was that Christians, as I was taught in church, when I was in the evangelical church, from which I learned a lot, that the serpent in the Garden of Eden is Satan. But he's not Satan in Jewish tradition. In fact, Satan isn't even there. I mean, he's just a clever snake, right?
Right.
He shouldn't do what he does, but he's not a power of evil. But if you look at paintings like Michelangelo's famous paintings of Adam and Eve, or you look at Christian paintings, you will see the snake is pictured as the serpent. I mean, is pictured as Satan. So Christians imagine that Jews always talked about Satan, but they really don't. They do talk about fallen angels, as you say. But it's quite an amazing story to think about the Bible not as something that dropped from heaven, written in divine script, but some stories that people told because they were trying to understand things. They were trying to sort out what was going on right here on earth. And the stories about Satan are part of that. But the problem with the stories of Satan today is that they teach us that conflict in the world, your conflict with anybody, is basically a conflict between good and evil, right? And you're the good one, and whoever you really don't like is evil. You can't negotiate with evil, right?
Right.
You have to annihilate evil. And that's why you can't negotiate political disputes. This idea of good and evil is very powerful in war. It's been used in war by Christians for 2,000 years, up from the 7th century against the Muslims, through the Iraq War. It's been used by Jews. It's been used by Muslims. You kill all the people because your enemies are evil. They're not just enemies. It's not just a territorial dispute or something. So that is very unfortunate in a world in which war can destroy the entire planet. And I think we ought to unlearn it.
So in that vein of what I got from that is, what we see in the New Testament, we're talking about the righteous blood of Abel down to Zechariah, is really a post-war scenario depicting why the temple's destruction, why judgment happened to you. But I guess what I was poking at is when the New Testament author, I think it's Matthew, or maybe was it John? It was John. You are of your father, the devil.
That's John.
Is he trying to say that you're from the line of Cain, or is he saying, what do you think is meant there, so to speak? Because I think there's an indication in Matthew where it sounds like it's this Cain idea. You know how the Jews talk about, no, they're not fallen angels. It's a bad line, a seed of humans, not fallen angels, or if you will, these giants aren't actual like supernatural beings. These are all humans. It's from the line of Cain that's wicked. Have you any idea how to rectify that idea?
Well, I'm not even sure. That's pretty complicated. But when John talks about certain things people do, he attributes them to Satan. Do you notice that in John's gospel, before Judas goes out to betray Jesus, it says Satan entered into him.